If you can't carry your own tray, maybe you should just stay home, Grandpa. This was the mocking comment from one man as the disabled veteran struggled with his meal. The room erupted with laughter. A nearby waiter turned his gaze away, pretending not to notice. The elderly man, however, continued forward, each step slow and shaky, his silence deafening. But then, from the back corner of the diner, something unexpected happened. A man in uniform rose to his feet. No shouting, no dramatic speeches, just one small act. And in that moment, the entire diner fell into an eerie silence. If you believe that quiet respect speaks louder than loud cruelty, leave a comment below that says, "Stand with him." Raymond Ray Dawson, 78 years old, walked into Molly's diner at exactly 9:15 a.m., just as he had every Sunday for the past 12 years. The retired Marine sergeant moved with painstaking slowness, each step a testament to the spinal injury he'd sustained in a helicopter crash during the Vietnam War, an injury that doctors had once said would leave him unable to walk. But Ray had different plans. Today, like all days before, he leaned on his wooden cane, its handle smooth and worn from years of use. He gave Jenny, the hostess, a quick nod. She knew his order by heart. Black coffee, 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast with no butter. "Morning, Sergeant Dawson," she said with a warm smile. "Your usual is ready." Despite his disability, Ray preferred the self-service counter. Carrying his own tray was challenging, but it allowed him to retain his sense of independence, something he valued far more than comfort. Each step was measured, slow, deliberate. He placed his cane carefully against the counter, steadying himself before gripping the tray with both hands. Slowly, he made his way across the busy diner, each step calculated to prevent spilling his coffee. From a nearby corner booth, for men in matching fishing tournament shirts, clearly tourists judging by the beers in their hands despite the early hour, observed Ray's careful progress. "Look at this one," one of them muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. "Takes 10 minutes to cross a room." Ray continued without a word, his eyes fixed on his destination, the booth by the window where the sunlight would offer some relief to his aching back. "Betty fakes the limp to get the veteran's discount," another man called out louder, hoping for a laugh. The chatter of the diner grew quieter as Marissa, a waitress who'd known Ray for years, hesitated by the kitchen door. She'd heard the comments, as had several nearby customers who suddenly found their plates very interesting. Ray's expression never changed. He simply kept moving, his focus unwavering. When he finally reached his booth and began to lower his tray, one of the forks slipped from the tray, clattering loudly to the floor. No one made a move to help him. Ray paused, contemplating the effort it would take to retrieve the fallen utensil. With great care, he began lowering himself, his hand trembling ever so slightly, not from the insult, but from the weight of age. He braced against the edge of the table. Then, just as he began the painful process of bending to pick it up, the man behind him laughed again. "I'd help, but I don't do cosplay." "Marines," he jeered. The cruel words hit like a punch, but Ray's face remained a stoic mask. Decades of military discipline had taught him to endure far worse. He reached down, his movements slow but steady, dignity intact, despite the pain that was clearly visible in the lines of his face. Marissa couldn't stand it any longer. She stepped forward and, without a word, retrieved the fallen fork, replacing it with a clean one. "I'm sorry about that, Mr. Dawson," she said quietly, casting a disapproving glance at the corner booth. Ray nodded once. "Not your fault, Marissa." He sat down, his movements still precise, the years of military training evident in the way he arranged his napkin across his lap and prepared his meal. His hands moved deliberately, as they had for every Sunday breakfast in the diner since the day he first walked through Molly's doors. The laughter from the corner booth continued, quieter now, but still aimed directly at Ray. Probably never even served. "That generation loves playing hero. My cousin's in the Marines now. They don't walk like that," another added. Ray continued to eat, his focus entirely on his plate. The slight tremor in his hand was the only sign that he had heard them. But Vietnam had taught him that survival often meant blocking out distractions, whether he was securing a landing zone or simply cutting his breakfast into manageable bites. What no one in the diner realized was that a man in a pristine military uniform was sitting quietly in the far corner booth, observing the entire interaction. His coffee remained untouched, his meal forgotten as his eyes stayed locked on Ray and the men mocking him. Colonel James Harrison, 45, had spent 25 years in the military. He didn't need to raise his voice to command attention. His presence alone was enough. He had noticed Ray immediately, recognizing him for who he was, even from across the room. Military men often see each other, even across generations. The colonel had watched the entire scene unfold, growing increasingly tense with each comment. His jaw tightened when the fork fell to the floor, and when no one moved to help, his expression shifted. Finally, one of the men in the corner booth noticed the colonel's unwavering stare. Perhaps emboldened by his friends or the beers they were drinking, he shouted out, "Hey, Colonel Sanders, want to back him up? Or is your uniform just for show too?" The conversation in the diner faltered as the confrontation became more direct. Ray remained focused on his breakfast, though a subtle stiffening of his shoulders betrayed his awareness. Slowly, Colonel Harrison rose. His movements were unhurried but deliberate, like someone who carried authority in every step. He walked directly to Ray's table, his gaze unwavering, but without a word. He bent down and picked up the fallen fork, gently placing it back on the edge of Ray's table. Then, without saying a single word, he stepped back and stood at attention, not beside Ray, but directly behind him. His posture was perfect, his hands at his sides, his feet at the correct angle, his eyes forward. It was the rigid stance of a soldier rendering honor to a fellow warrior. The entire diner fell into a deep silence. It wasn't a grand gesture or an over-the-top display. It was simply a man in uniform standing at attention behind a seated veteran, and the message was clear. This man deserves respect, and I stand with him. Ray glanced up briefly, meeting the colonel's eyes in the reflection of the window beside his booth. A silent understanding passed between them, a bond forged in the fires of shared service. Marissa froze in her tracks, her coffee pot still tilted over a customer's cup. Jenny, the hostess, straightened instinctively. The atmosphere in the diner had changed. The four men in the corner booth went completely silent, their smirks fading as they registered not just the colonel's rank, but the seriousness of his stance. For 30 seconds, no one in Molly's diner spoke. No silverware clinked, no cups rattled. The only sounds were the hum of the kitchen fan and the distant traffic outside. Colonel Harrison stood firm, a living statue of dignity standing guard over a fellow soldier's meal. If you've ever wished for someone to stand up for you, sometimes all it takes is for them to stand. If you believe that honor still walks into rooms quietly, leave a comment that says respect below. After what felt like an eternity, Colonel Harrison finally shifted his stance. He remained standing, but now he turned to face the men in the corner booth. His expression was not angry, but resolute. He reached into the breast pocket of his uniform and pulled out a weathered photograph, sealed in clear plastic. Without saying a word, he held it up for everyone to see. The photo was old, its edges yellowed with time. It showed a much younger Ray Dawson, dressed in combat fatigues, leading a group of Marines through the thick jungle. His face was streaked with mud, and possibly blood, but his expression carried the same quiet determination that Ray still held today. In his arms, he carried a wounded soldier. This man, the colonel's voice broke the silence, his words echoing clearly in the diner, carried me out of a burning convoy outside Da Nang in 1972. 3 miles through enemy territory with a bullet in his own leg. The colonel lowered the photograph, making eye contact with the men who had been mocking Ray. Sergeant Dawson is the reason I'm alive today. The reason I have a family. The reason I wear this rank. Ray continued eating, his attention on his meal, though his hand trembled slightly. This wasn't a story he had shared with the staff at Molly's. Not out of modesty, but because some memories belong to the past. One of the hecklers shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly feeling the weight of his actions. "We didn't know," he muttered. "You didn't ask," the colonel replied, his tone calm but firm. Then, he turned toward Marissa, who was still frozen in place. "I'd like to cover Sergeant Dawson's meal today," he said. Then, raising his voice slightly so everyone could hear, he added, "And I want everyone here to know that from now on, this diner stands under his name, at least as far as the United States Marine Corps is concerned." From the back of the diner, the door to the owner's office opened. Michael Molly, the elderly owner of the diner, stepped out. He had clearly been watching the scene unfold through the security monitors in the back. "I saw everything," he said, walking toward Ray's table. "And I'd like to ask your permission for something, Sergeant Dawson." Ray looked up, his face unreadable. "I'd like to name this booth after you officially," Molly said, gesturing to the window seat Ray had occupied every Sunday for over a decade. "If that's all right with you, Sergeant." For the first time since entering the diner, Ray's expression softened slightly. "No need for that, Michael," he said, his voice steady. But Michael shook his head. "There's every need," he insisted, glancing around at the now silent customers. "Some lessons are worth making permanent." The corner booth, once full of derisive laughter, was now completely quiet. The men who had mocked Ray were staring into their beers, their expressions heavy with shame. Michael turned toward them directly. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice firm yet calm, "I think it's time you settled."